The morning Celia Prescott rode into Dustfall, Texas. She had $17, a loaded Remington pistol, and a reputation for shooting straighter than most men twice her age. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Dustfall sat on the edge of the Llano Estacado like a wound that hadn't quite healed, a scattering of sun-bleached buildings pressed into the red earth as though trying to hide from the sky. The wind came in from the west that day, carrying the smell of rain that would never arrive, and the dust curled up from the main street in small spiraling columns that twisted and fell apart before they reached the rooftops. Celia rode in on a sorrel mare named Juniper, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that made strangers step out of the way without quite knowing why. She had come from Amarillo, where she had buried her father 3 weeks prior, and sold the remnants of a cattle operation that had been bleeding money since her mother passed 4 years before that. She was 26 years old, and she had learned, through the accumulated weight of disappointment, that the world did not much care what a woman needed. It simply presented her with circumstances, and she could either fold or stand. Celia Prescott had never been particularly good at folding. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Her father's older brother, a man named Otis Prescott, had a homestead 11 miles east of Dustfall, and he had written to her father twice in the last year asking for family to come help work it. Otis was 61 and his hands had gone stiff with rheumatism, and the land needed tending that he could no longer provide. Celia had nowhere else to go, and honest work, even hard work, even thankless work, was something she understood. She tied Juniper to the post outside Haverson's general store and went inside to ask for directions to her uncle's property. The man behind the counter, a broad-shouldered fellow with a ginger mustache and sympathetic eyes, told her the directions readily enough. Then he paused, his hands flat on the counter, and said something that made her still. "You're Otis Prescott's niece. Miss, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Otis took ill back in February. He passed the second week of March." Celia stood in the middle of that store for a long, slow moment, and the dust motes drifted through the slanted afternoon light, and she breathed in and breathed out and did not let her expression change. She thanked the man, asked if the property had been sold, learned that it had not, and walked back out into the street. $17, a horse, a pistol, a piece of land 11 miles east that she had never seen and now owned by inheritance, assuming the county records could be made to cooperate, which in her experience required a particular kind of stubbornness and patience she was still in possession of. She stood on the porch of Haverson's general store and looked at the length of Dustfall's main street, at the saloon and the livery, and the small adobe building that served as the sheriff's office, at the women walking in pairs with their skirts pulled up from the dust, at the men lounging against posts and squinting at her with the particular squint of men who had catalogued a woman and found themselves not sure what to make of her. And that was when she first saw Clarence Walker. He came around the corner from the livery leading a tall black horse by the reins, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had made peace with the pace of the world and found no reason to rush it. He was tall, lean through the shoulders but broad enough to suggest real strength, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that carried a few days of shadow. He was wearing a worn canvas coat the color of a winter sky and boots that had seen considerable use, and he had a deputy's badge pinned to his chest that caught the afternoon sun. He was not the kind of man who would have stood out in a crowd, Celia thought. He had no particular feature that drew the eye on its own. It was the whole of him, the way he moved, the way he held the horse's reins with easy familiarity, the way he glanced up at her without the squint, without the calculation, with something that was simply curiosity and a tip of his hat that made her notice him. She looked away. She had things to deal with. She did not have the time or inclination to notice men. She went into the sheriff's office, which smelled of coffee and old paper, and explained her situation to Sheriff Amos Holt, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a white beard and the weary eyes of someone who had arbitrated too many disputes to find any of them particularly interesting anymore. He listened, asked a few pointed questions, and told her that the property documentation would need to be reviewed, and that it might take several days, and that in the meantime she might find lodging at the boarding house on the east end of the street, run by a Mrs. Ida Fowler. "Do you have a deputy named Walker?" she asked, because she had seen the badge and she was practical about gathering information. "Clarence Walker, yes." "Best man I've got," the sheriff said, with the simple candor of a man who saw no reason to oversell or undersell. "You have business with him." "Not yet," Celia said and walked out. She did not mean anything particular by it. She was simply taking inventory of the town the way she had learned to take inventory of any new terrain. Know the useful people. Know the dangerous ones. Know which category each person fell into before you needed to call on that knowledge. She settled Juniper at the livery, secured a room at Mrs. Fowler's boarding house, and spent the remainder of that first afternoon reviewing what she owned and what she owed, and what she needed to do to make the situation workable. The numbers were not comfortable. The property was hers, but it needed hands to work it, and she had capital enough for perhaps 3 or 4 months of very careful living before she would need to find another solution. She ate supper at the boarding house table with 3 other boarders, a traveling dry goods salesman named Patterson who talked too much, a schoolteacher named Agnes Whitmore who was quiet and watchful in a way Celia appreciated, and Clarence Walker. He sat across from her at the long table, passing the bread without being asked, and listening to Patterson with the patient expression of a man who had heard many things that interested him less than this, but had determined not to show it. He did not try to talk to her during the meal. He answered when Patterson directed something his way, helped himself to the beef stew that Mrs. Fowler had made with the spare economy of a very good cook, and occasionally glanced in Celia's direction with that same frank, uncalculating attention that she had noticed on the street. After supper, when the others had drifted off and Mrs. Fowler was clearing the table, he stopped beside her on the porch and said, without any particular preamble, "You're the one who came in to talk to Amos about the Prescott property." "Word travels fast," Celia said. "Small town," he said, and there was no apology in it, just acknowledgement of fact. "It belonged to Otis Prescott. He was a good man. I'm sorry about your loss." She looked at him then properly, the way she looked at things she was trying to assess. He was perhaps 29 or 30, she thought. His eyes were dark gray in the fading light, steady without being hard. He meant it, the condolence. She could tell because he did not follow it with any of the things people usually followed condolences with, the small performances of sympathy that were really just a bridge to the subject they actually wanted to discuss. "Thank you," she said. "If you need someone to ride out with you to look at the property, I can do that," he said. "I know the land out that way. Otis let me hunt on it from time to time." "I'll be fine on my own," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. "I have no doubt of that," he said, and there was nothing sarcastic in it, nothing diminishing. He said it the way you said something you believed. Then he tipped his hat and went inside, and she stood on the porch in the cooling evening air and listened to the town settle into its nighttime sounds, the distant music from the saloon, the horses in the livery, the wind coming down off the plain, and she thought that he was either a very honest man or a very skilled one at appearing honest, and she did not yet know which. She rode out to the property the next morning alone, the way she had said she would. The land was 11 miles of hard riding on a road that was more suggestion than fact, a pair of wheel-rut tracks through the scrub and the cedar, and when she finally came to the property line marked by a rusted iron post and a cedar fence that needed significant repair, she stopped and looked at what she had inherited. The house was a small adobe structure with a covered porch that sagged on one side. There was a barn behind it that was in better shape, solidly built from cedar timber, and a corral that had once held cattle but now held only the memory of them. There was a hand-dug well with a good rope and a sound bucket. There was a kitchen garden that had gone to weeds, and behind the barn there was a small cemetery with two markers, one of them fresh enough that the wood had not yet weathered. She walked to them. The newer one read Otis James Prescott, 1817 to 1878. The older one, more weathered, she could just make out, Celia Prescott, 1820 to 1871. She stood there for a while in the morning quiet, the grasshoppers already making their noise in the dry grass, and she told herself that she was going to make this work. She had said it before, in other circumstances, and she had been right often enough that she believed it still. She spent 3 days at the property before she came back to Dustfall, sleeping in the house on a cot she found in the back room, eating what she had brought and supplemented with what she could find, cleaning and assessing and making lists. The roof needed patching in 2 places. The fence along the south pasture was down for 40 yards. The kitchen garden, if cleared and replanted, could be productive by late summer. The barn was sound. The well was deep and clean. The soil in the east field was hard, but workable if it got proper rain. She came back to town with 3 pages of notes and a list of supplies she needed to purchase, and when she walked into Haverson's general store, Clarence Walker was standing at the counter buying cartridges for a Winchester, and he looked up and said, simply and without the kind of relief that would have annoyed her, "Glad to see you made it back all right." "Did you have reason to doubt it?" she said. "No," he said, "but I'm glad anyway." She did not know what to do with that, so she moved past him and began consulting her list with Haverson. She could hear Walker and the storekeeper talking while she worked through her order, the ordinary talk of a small town. Who needed what? What was coming in on the supply wagon from Abilene? Whether the water in the creek south of town was holding? She was aware of him the way she was aware of the weather, a constant low-level attention that she did not particularly choose but could not quite set aside. When she had placed her order and was told it would be ready for collection the following morning, she turned and found that Walker had gone. She told herself she was not disappointed because she was not, she was practical, and practical women did not make note of the departure of men they had spoken to twice. She collected her supplies the following morning and drove them out to the property in a borrowed wagon, and she spent the rest of that week working. She was good at work. She had always been good at work. She patched the roof with cedar shingles she had purchased, and climbed up there herself with a hammer and nails and fixed both leaks. And she did not think too much about anything except the angle of the nails and whether the shingles were seated properly. On the Friday of that first week, she heard a horse on the road and looked up from where she was working in the kitchen garden to see Clarence Walker coming up the track on his black horse, and he was not in his deputy's shirt today but in a plain work shirt, and there was no badge visible, and he had his hat pushed back on his head and a coil of fence wire tied to his saddle. "I heard in town your south fence was down," he said. She straightened up and looked at him. "Who told you that?" "Nobody specifically. I just remembered Otis had trouble with it last summer and figured it might not have improved on its own." She wiped her hands on her skirt and regarded him. "I didn't ask for help." "No," he agreed, "you didn't." He did not move to dismount or to stay, just sat there on the horse with an easy patience, the reins loose in his hands, waiting. "The south fence is down 40 yards, she said finally. "Have you done much fence work?" "Enough," he said, and swung down from the saddle. They worked through the afternoon without much conversation, and she found that she did not mind working alongside him because he did not talk for the sake of filling silence, and he did not correct her or offer instruction when she had already demonstrated she knew what she was doing. He worked with a straightforward competence that she respected, the wire going up clean and tight, the post sitting true, and when a post gave him trouble he dealt with it without complaint and without asking her to watch him struggle. When they had the fence mended, she heated water on the stove and made coffee, the way you did when someone had done you a service, because there were still courtesies that applied even when you had not asked for the help in the first place. They sat on the porch steps with the cups, the sun going orange and red in the west, and the plain stretching out in that extraordinary way it had at dusk, when the light lay long and golden across the grass and the cedar threw shadows like dark fingers. "Why are you here?" she asked, and she meant in the larger sense in Dustfall, not on her porch, though she meant that too. He considered the question. "I came through about 3 years ago on my way somewhere else, and Amos Holt offered me the deputy position. I was good at what was required, I stayed. Where were you going before you stopped?" "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "West, mostly. I had the idea that the right place was out there somewhere and I'd know it when I arrived." He paused. "Dustfall isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something different," he said, "but it has its qualities." He looked at her then, that direct, unhurried look. "Do you intend to stay?" "I intend to make this property work," she said carefully, because she was a careful woman with her words when the words mattered. "Whether that becomes staying depends on whether I can make it work." "That seems reasonable," he said. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, drinking their coffee while the sky deepened from orange to purple, and the first stars appeared over the eastern plain, and she thought again that he was probably an honest man. She had been wrong about honest men before, of course. She had been wrong in the most spectacular and costly way a person could be wrong, and she carried that with her the way you carried a healed bone, not painful anymore but changed, a place where things had knit together differently than they were before. He left when the coffee was done, and she watched him ride back down the track toward town in the gathering dark, and then she went inside and lit the lamp and sat at the table with her notebook and her lists, and she told herself that she had not given him any encouragement, and that was the correct and sensible thing to do. He came back the following Saturday. He brought a young man with him this time, a Mexican boy of about 16 named Tomas, who worked at the livery and apparently had Saturdays free and was willing to work for a fair day's wage. And Clarence had already paid the boy from his own pocket, which Celia discovered only after the fact, and which made her furious in a way she found difficult to fully express, because the gesture was too well-intentioned to receive honest anger. "I don't need you buying help for me," she told Clarence, while Tomas was busy in the barn, industriously mucking out stalls and showing a cheerful immunity to the tension between the adults. "I know you don't need it," Clarence said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "But you're working alone out here every day of the week, and there's more to do than one person can manage. Tomas needs the money. I have the money." It seemed like a practical solution. "It wasn't your problem to solve." "No," he said, "but I solved it anyway because I wanted to. I understand if that annoys you." She looked at him for a long moment. The honesty of it disarmed her more than she wanted it to. Men who admitted they had done something partly for their own reasons were a rarity, and she was suspicious of them, the way she was suspicious of most rarities, wondering what purpose the admission served. "It annoys me," she said finally, "but I'll allow it this once." Something changed in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, that was more like the settling of something. "That's all I need," he said, and went to help Tomas. The three of them worked through the morning, and at noon Celia made a meal from what she had, corn bread and salt pork and beans she had put on to cook before dawn, and they ate at the table inside, and Tomas told them about his family, his mother who took in laundry, his younger brother who wanted to be a schoolteacher. Clarence listened to the boy the way he listened to everything, with genuine attention, asking questions that showed he had actually heard the answers, and she watched this without appearing to watch it. She had been engaged once. She was not ashamed of the fact, but she did not discuss it, because it was a private piece of her history, and she preferred her history private. The man's name had been Robert Alderman, and he had been charming and certain, and full of intentions that turned out to be mostly performances, beautiful in the dark, gone in the morning light. He had promised her a house and a future and his name, and when the time came to make good on those promises, he had found reasons to delay, and the delays had accumulated into an absence that was eventually permanent. She had been 23. She had lost nothing except her willingness to trust the things people said after sundown. That was the wound that had knit crooked. She could feel it sometimes, a specific alertness when a man was kind to her, a waiting for the shape of it to resolve into something she recognized. Clarence Walker was kind in the daytime, in the plain and unglamorous light of actual work and actual words, and she noticed this and was made uneasy by it. The summer came on hard and fast the way it did in West Texas, the heat arriving in early June like something with intentions. Celia planted her kitchen garden and replanted it when the first planting failed, and she hired Tomas on a more regular basis, paying him from her own funds this time, and she began to understand the rhythms of the land, what it needed, what it could give. She had 3 hens and a rooster she bought from a farmer named Greeley who lived 2 miles up the road, and a small kitchen garden that was beginning to show the kind of promise that required daily attention and made demands on a person in exchange for rewarding them. Clarence came out most Saturdays, sometimes on other days when his duties were light. He never arrived with the air of someone doing her a favor. He arrived the way you arrived at a place where work needed doing, and you had time and inclination to do it. He brought news from town because she went to town only once a week, and there was news to carry. He brought her books occasionally, borrowed from a small lending collection at the school, because he had discovered she read and thought she might like something that wasn't a supply catalog or a county deed document. He brought her a copy of a George Eliot novel in July, and she read it in 3 evenings by lamplight, and returned it to him the following Saturday with her opinions formed and ready, and he had opinions of his own, and they argued about it on the porch steps in the evening warmth with the same focused engagement she had brought to fence mending and roof repair. And she thought, with a startled clarity that she immediately suppressed, that this was one of the most enjoyable conversations she had had in years. She went to town on a Wednesday in mid-July for supplies, and she stopped into the sheriff's office to report that she had found the remains of a cut fence on the north side of her property, which suggested that cattle had been moved across her land without permission. Sheriff Holt listened and made notes and said he would look into it, and Clarence was there, and he listened too, and after she left, she could feel his attention following her out the door, not in the uncomfortable way of men who watched women with presumption, but in the way of someone who was paying attention to something they cared about. She was in the general store when she heard raised voices from the street, and she stepped outside to see that 3 men from the Caldwell outfit, which was a large cattle operation 20 miles north that had a history of disputes with the smaller landholders in the county, were having words with old Ben Greeley, the man who had sold her the chickens. The Caldwell men were big and loud and had the confidence of men who knew they had numbers and backing, and Greeley was a small man in his 60s who was clearly frightened. Celia walked toward them, which was perhaps not the most prudent action, but she had never found prudence and inaction to be a reliable pairing. "What's the trouble?" she said, in the flat, direct tone she used when she was not inviting discussion, only information. The Caldwell men turned to look at her with the various expressions that men wore when a woman entered their disagreement, ranging from dismissal to annoyance to a particular kind of contempt that she had encountered before, and found only interesting in that it told her immediately what kind of man she was dealing with. "This is none of your concern," said the largest of the 3. "Mr. Greeley is my neighbor," she said. "That makes it partially my concern. It might have escalated. Things in Dustfall could escalate with a frustrating ease sometimes." But Clarence appeared from the direction of the sheriff's office, badge visible, hand easy but not threatening, and he said in a measured voice, "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" And the kind of problem that had been forming quietly rearranged itself. She did not thank him because she did not think she needed to, and she thought that if she thanked him he might think she had needed the rescue, which she hadn't. But she looked at him briefly, and something passed between them that was an acknowledgment without being a statement. Later, she thought about that look for longer than she meant to. One evening in late July, She rode into town as the sun was setting because she had run low on lamp oil and could not do without it, and she was on her way back to the livery to collect Juniper when she nearly ran directly into Clarence coming out of the sheriff's office at a pace that meant something had happened. "There's a fire," he said, not stopping but angling toward her, "at the Greeley place. Ben and his wife got out, but the barn is fully involved." She didn't think. She turned and went with him. That was simply what you did. They rode the 2 miles to Greeley's in the thickening dusk, and the barn was indeed fully involved, a bright orange horror against the darkening sky, and there was nothing to save it. But Greeley's horses were still in the corral beside it, panicking against the rails, and without discussion Celia went to the corral gate while Clarence went for the closest horse, and she opened the gate and stepped back, and they moved the horses away from the heat and the danger with the efficiency of 2 people who had the same instinct about what mattered. Mrs. Greeley was standing with her husband near the house, her face white with shock, and Celia went to her and took her hands, which were shaking badly. "Are you hurt?" Celia asked. "Either of you?" "No, no, we're all right," Mrs. Greeley said, and then she began to cry, quiet and dignified and heartbreaking, the way very old people cried when they were beyond the point of pretending things were fine. Ben Greeley looked at his barn burning in the night and said nothing at all, just stood there with the terrible stillness of a man watching something he had built with his own hands being reduced to nothing. And Celia stayed beside Mrs. Greeley and held her hands, and did not offer empty words because she did not have any. Clarence organized the few men who had followed from town into a water bucket line to try to keep the fire from reaching the house, which was a near thing for about an hour, and the smell of smoke and burning cedar was thick in the air, and when it was finally clear that the house would survive, he came and stood beside Celia in the yard, both of them smelling of smoke, and he looked very tired. "Do you know how it started?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "Could be an accident. Could be the Caldwell outfit making a point." He said the second possibility with a flatness that suggested he believed it. "They've been cutting my fence," she said. He looked at her. "How many times?" "Twice more since I reported the first time. I've been repairing it, and I didn't think another report would do much when the first one didn't." "It does more than you think," he said. "Every report is a record. Records matter if it comes to a legal dispute." She nodded. Then, because they were standing in Ben Greeley's yard with the ruins of his barn still glowing and the Greeleys sitting on their porch wrapped in a quilt that someone had brought, she said, "I'm going to bring them breakfast tomorrow." "Do you know if they have family in the county?" "Their son is in Abilene," he said. "I'll send a wire." "Good," she said. And then, because she meant it and because there were moments when practical people acknowledged practical things, "You work well in a crisis." He looked at her with that steady gray regard. "So do you," he said. She rode home that night in the dark alone because there was no reason to do otherwise, and she thought about Ben Greeley's face while he watched his barn burn, and she thought about the Caldwell outfit and their particular brand of pressure, and she thought about Clarence Walker standing in the yard smelling of smoke, tired and steady, saying, "So do you." She was not, she told herself firmly, developing feelings. She was making an assessment of a person's character based on observable evidence. That was entirely different. She brought breakfast to the Greeleys the next morning, corn cakes and sausage and coffee, and Mrs. Greeley clutched her hands and said she was a good woman and a blessing, and Celia felt the words settle in her chest in an uncomfortable way because she was not sure she deserved them and was also not sure she didn't. The Greeley boy, whose name was James, and who was 25 and broad through the shoulders like a man who had worked hard all his life, arrived from Abilene 4 days later and set about building a new barn with the help of several neighbors. Celia went on 2 of those days and worked alongside the men, hauling timber and holding boards and handing up tools, and no one said anything about whether it was appropriate for a woman to do such work because this was the frontier, and on the frontier, a person who showed up and worked was simply welcome. Clarence was there on both days, and they worked near each other the way people do when they have established a rhythm together, not always talking, often just moving through the same space with an ease that had taken her a while to notice was unusual. She was not easy with people in general. She had always been a little apart, even from those she liked, a habit of self-containment that came from being the one who held things together, from being the person who did not have the luxury of leaning because there was no one position to hold her weight. She caught herself thinking about what it would feel like to lean sometimes, and she stopped the thought every time with a firm and practiced hand. In August, on a Saturday that started like any other Saturday, Clarence arrived with something different in his expression. He unsaddled his horse and led it into the small corral she had built adjacent to the barn, and he came to where she was working in the garden and he said, "I need to tell you something." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing in the full sun, his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had decided something and was not entirely comfortable with having decided it but had decided it anyway. "I've been thinking," he said, and then stopped, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. "About what?" she said. "About whether I should say what I'm thinking," he said. "And I've decided I should, because not saying it feels dishonest, and I'd rather be honest with you even if it makes things uncomfortable between us." She was still, the way she became still when something important was arriving, and she needed all her attention available to receive it. "I have a great deal of respect for you," he said. "That's not what this is about, or not only what it's about. I also find myself looking forward to Saturdays in a way I don't look forward to other days. I find myself thinking about how you see things, and wanting to know what you think about things I encounter during the week. And I find myself concerned about your welfare out here in a way that is not purely neighborly." She looked at him for a long, careful moment. She was aware of her own pulse, the sound of the wind in the grass, the distant complaint of a mockingbird somewhere in the cedar. "Clarence," she said, and she used his name deliberately, the way you used a person's name when you wanted them to hear that you were taking them seriously. "I've been through something with a man before. I won't go into the details of it, but the short version is that I was made promises in the dark that turned out to have no substance in the light. I'm not able to take men at their word anymore, especially about the things that matter most. I have no patience for it. I won't subject myself to that kind of particular humiliation again." He held her gaze and did not look away and did not look wounded, though she thought the words might have landed as they were intended to, with weight. "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she said, not challenging him, genuinely asking. "I think so," he said. "You're telling me that whatever I say about how I feel, in whatever light I say it, you can't take it as the truth of a thing, because you've been given words before that turned out to be hollow, and that the experience has taught you rightly to wait for something more than words." She was slightly startled by how precisely he had understood her. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I'm telling you." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the plain beyond the garden fence. Then he said, "Then I won't make you any promises in the dark, Celia. I won't make you promises in the evening when everything is soft and easy to say things in. I'll come back tomorrow morning, and if I still have something worth saying in the plain light of day, I'll say it then." He looked at her again. "Would that be all right?" She did not know what to say, which was unusual for her. She was not accustomed to men who responded to her caution with caution of their own, with a respect for the shape of her particular hurt rather than an attempt to argue her out of it. "That would be all right," she said finally. He nodded. He put his hat back on his head. "Do you need anything done today before I go?" he asked, and there was no wounded edge to it, no performance of hurt, just the same practical readiness he always had. "The corral gate has been sticking," she said. "I'll fix it," he said, and went to do it, and she stayed in the garden and listened to the sound of his work and felt something she could not quite name shifting around in her chest. He left in the early evening and she went to bed, and she did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark in the small adobe house and listened to the prairie night, the insects and the occasional distant sound of a coyote, and she thought about a man who had offered to wait until morning. She was up before the sun. She had always been an early riser, but she was up before even her usual time, and she built the fire in the stove and put the coffee on and stood on the porch in the cool gray pre-dawn and watched the sky lighten in the east, that first thin line of pale gold along the horizon that preceded everything. She heard his horse on the road when the sky was light, but the sun had not yet cleared the horizon. She had not known if he would actually come. She had thought he might, because he had said he would, and he was a man who did what he said. But she had also known that the morning had a way of clarifying intentions, of making things that felt certain in the afternoon feel much less so in the fresh and unforgiving light of a new day. He tied his horse to the post and walked up to the porch, and she handed him a cup of coffee because she had made it knowing he might be here. And he took it with both hands, and they stood in the quiet of the early morning and watched the sun come up over the Llano Estacado together. When the sun was fully up and the light was honest and clear and there was nowhere to hide in it, he turned to her and he said, "I would like to court you properly, with your permission, and with the understanding that I am not making promises about what comes of it, because I think you'd find that presumptuous, and so would I. But I am telling you that my interest in you is genuine, and that it is not something I arrived at quickly or without thinking carefully about what it means to say so." She looked at the sun on the plain, the way it struck the grass, and turned it briefly to something that looked like copper, and she thought about all the reasons to say no, and about how she had been protecting herself for 3 years, and whether the protection had become something that was going to outlast the thing it was protecting. "You may court me," she said, and heard in her own voice something that was very close to hope, which was a terrifying thing to hear from yourself when you had spent considerable effort keeping hope at a manageable distance. "Thank you," he said simply, the way he said most things, without decoration. "Don't make me regret it," she said, and it was not entirely a joke. "I won't," he said, and it was not a promise made in the dark. It was a statement of fact made in full sunlight, and she held it differently because of that. What followed was a courtship that looked from the outside, she suspected, like two people who had been together for years and simply had not gotten around to formalizing it. It was in the work they did alongside each other, and in the meals shared at her table and occasionally at Mrs. Fowler's boarding house, where Clarence still rented his room. It was in the conversations that went long into the evenings on the porch steps, ranging from the practical to the philosophical, from what to do about the Caldwell outfit to whether a person could make a genuine choice in life, or simply enacted the person they already were. He brought her a piece of news in September that she had not known she needed until she heard it. He had been to the county seat at Tascosa to deal with a matter of documentation, and while there, he had spoken to the county land registrar and confirmed that all the paperwork regarding the Prescott property was properly recorded in her name. He laid the document on her table with no ceremony, just placed it there and stepped back, and she picked it up and read it and felt something settle in her that she had not known was still unsettled. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I was there anyway," he said, "and I knew you were concerned about the recording." She had been concerned about it. She had not told him she was concerned about it. He had simply known, the way he seemed to know things about her that she had not explicitly communicated, not by reading her mind, but by paying the kind of sustained and genuine attention that eventually allowed a person to understand another person's concerns without being told them. She was not, she admitted to herself quietly, succeeding at not developing feelings. October came and the heat broke in the way of the Texas Panhandle, not gradually but all at once, the way a promise is kept, definitively and without negotiation. The nights turned cold and the days turned sharp and bright, and the plain took on the particular golden color of the fall that she had not seen before but recognized as something she would want to see every year from now on, which was a thought she filed away carefully because it contained implications. The Caldwell situation came to a head in October. 3 of Caldwell's men were caught in the act of cutting her fence by Tomas, who had seen them from the road and had the presence of mind to ride directly to town and find Clarence. Clarence rode out with Sheriff Holt, and they found the men in the act, which was undeniable, and there was a confrontation that was tense in the way of confrontations, where the wrong party knows they have been caught and is deciding between belligerence and retreat. Caldwell's men chose belligerence initially, which led to words and then to a brief and ugly altercation that left 2 of Caldwell's men detained, and one of them with a broken nose, acquired through his own attempt to take a swing at the deputy that went badly for the swing taker. Clarence had not sought violence, she knew, because she could see in him the reluctance of a man who found conflict unpleasant but would not back away from it when it was necessary. The Caldwell outfit backed down considerably after that. The rancher himself came to town the following week and spoke to Sheriff Holt and paid a fine, and the fence cutting stopped. It was not a complete resolution of the broader friction between the large cattle operations and the smaller homesteaders, because that was a larger and older struggle that the entire West was working through, but for her specific situation, it was enough. She thanked Clarence one evening for the record he had advised her to build with her reports because it had mattered in exactly the way he said it would. "You did the right thing by reporting," he said. "I just told you why it was worth doing." "That counts," she said. He looked at her with a thoughtfulness that was becoming familiar to her, that slight settling of his expression that meant he was about to say something he had been carrying for a while. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to tell you something I've been thinking about, but I want to make sure I tell you in the right conditions." She almost smiled because she knew what he meant. "Is it daytime?" she said. "The sun is fully up," he agreed, and there was something in the corners of his eyes that was warm and quiet and very certain. "It is about 8:30 in the morning. I have been thinking about this since approximately 4 this morning, and I can confirm that it has survived the night." She turned fully toward him on the porch steps and gave him her complete attention. "I love you," he said. "I love the way you work and the way you think and the way you refuse to make things easier than they are. I love that you are stubborn in the right ways and honest in a way that cost you something to maintain. I love that you are afraid in some ways and that you haven't let the fear make you smaller. I would like, when you are ready and not a moment before, to ask you to marry me. Not because I need a partner or because it makes practical sense, although it does make practical sense, but because I think I am better in the world when you are in it, and I would like to be in your world for as long as you'll have me." The morning light lay clean and golden on the plain, and there was not a cloud in the sky. She could hear the chickens in the yard and the sound of the wind, and somewhere her horse Juniper moving in the corral. Everything was perfectly ordinary and also completely transformed. She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know things you have been both hoping for and dreading, carrying the knowledge quietly and examining it in private moments. And she had spent considerable time asking herself whether she trusted him, because trust was the real thing, beneath all the practical matters of land and livelihood and loneliness. She trusted him. She had not been expecting to trust another man, and she had arrived at it slowly and without drama, through Saturdays and shared work and plain daytime conversations, through the absence of promises made in the dark and the presence of actions taken in full light. He had not told her who he was. He had showed her consistently and without fanfare, and she had seen it. "I love you too," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth because she had not said them in a long time and she had forgotten how much weight they carried. "And I would like to say yes to your eventual proposal when you make it." "When I make it," he said, with that thing in his eyes that was warm and certain and not going anywhere. "Not in the dark." "Not in the dark," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, this particular expression that meant he was happy in a way that surprised him. Then he said, "Would Sunday morning be acceptable?" "I was thinking perhaps in the church yard after the service in front of whatever witnesses the Sunday congregation provides." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected and surprised her with its fullness. That would be acceptable, she said. That Sunday, he did exactly that. He waited until after Reverend Clark had finished the service, and the congregation was milling in the sunny yard of the small white church. And then Clarence Walker, who was not a showy man and had never been, went down on one knee in the churchyard dirt in his good shirt and his polished boots and asked Celia Prescott to be his wife. There were approximately 40 people present. She said yes clearly enough that everyone heard it, and the congregation produced a sound of collective pleasure that was genuine and warm, because Dustfall was the kind of small town where the happiness of its people was a genuinely communal matter, and Mrs. Fowler made a small sound that was half exclamation and half sob, and Agnes Whitmore, the schoolteacher, clapped her hands together with an expression of great satisfaction, and old Ben Greeley, who was there with his wife and his son James, reached over and gripped Mrs. Greeley's hand. Tomas, who was there at the edge of the group, grinned so widely that it transformed his face entirely, and Celia met his eyes and smiled back at him because he deserved to be included in this. They were married on the last Saturday of November in the same church, with Reverend Clark presiding. Agnes Whitmore stood up for Celia, having become a genuine friend over the preceding months. A quiet and steady friendship that Celia valued precisely because Agnes was like her in certain ways, clear-eyed about the world, not inclined to pretend that things were other than they were, but also not inclined to miss the beauty of the things that were actually beautiful. Sheriff Holt stood up for Clarence, which moved Clarence more than he quite managed to conceal, because Amos Holt was not a demonstrative man, and the gesture was understood by everyone present for what it was. Celia had made her own dress, a deep blue wool that was practical enough to be worn again and lovely enough that when she walked into the church on Ben Greeley's arm, because she had asked him to walk her in and he had nearly come apart with the honor of it, Clarence looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot quite believe he gets to have. The ceremony was simple. The vows were the old words, but when Clarence spoke them, he spoke them in that direct, unhurried way he had, looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and she heard each word as a specific and considered statement rather than a recitation. When it was her turn, she spoke with equal deliberateness, giving each word its full weight, because she was not a woman who said things she did not mean, and was not about to begin with these particular words. The reception was held at the church hall, which the women of the congregation had decorated with cedar boughs and dried flowers, and there was a fiddle player and dancing on the swept pine floor, and Celia, who had not danced in years, found herself dancing with her husband in the circle of lamplight while the fiddle played something bright and fast, and she laughed again the way she had been laughing more often in recent months, freely and without caution, and Clarence, who was not particularly graceful but was enthusiastic and had good rhythm, grinned at her in a way that made her think that this ordinary joyful evening in a church hall in a small West Texas town was what happiness was made of. They moved into her property together, which became their property, after a brief and practical conversation about the arrangement of the boarding house room and the house on the land that resulted in the obvious conclusion. Clarence's things were few, which she appreciated, because he was a man who did not accumulate what he did not need. He had his Winchester and his Colt and his good saddle, and a trunk of clothes and books, and a few items of sentimental value, including a photograph of his parents taken in St. Louis before the war, a portrait of two people who looked to have been good to each other. She added a room to the house that winter. Well, they added it together, Clarence and Tomas and James Greeley, who had decided to stay in Dustfall after the barn fire and had taken up work as a carpenter's assistant, which suited his considerable strength and his careful hands. The room was built from cedar timber and adobe, and it was warm and solid, and it became the room that eventually their son was born in, which made it meaningful beyond its practical function. But that was the spring of 1879, And before spring came there was winter. And the winter of 1878 in the Texas Panhandle was the kind of winter that the land seemed to produce with the specific intention of testing who was serious about staying. The norther blew in December and brought temperatures that turned the water in the barrel to solid ice, and made going to the barn before dawn a matter of genuine physical fortitude. The cattle and horses needed tending regardless of the cold, and Celia and Clarence did it together in the frozen dark, wrapped in every practical layer they owned, and it was not romantic in any particular way, but it was something she thought was more valuable than romance. It was the knowledge that you were not enduring it alone. She made discoveries about him in the winter that she had not had the opportunity to make in the warmer months. She discovered that he made very good coffee and that he had opinions about it. She discovered that he read even more than she had known, having more books in his trunk than she had imagined, and that he had a particular love of history, the real recorded history of events and people, which led to long evenings by the stove reading aloud to each other from whatever they had, which was one of the more intimate experiences of her life in a way she had not anticipated. She discovered that he had a quiet and dry sense of humor that deployed itself at unexpected moments, and that he almost never laughed loudly but often looked at things with an expression of private amusement that, once she knew to look for it, she found she was trying to earn. She discovered that he had some darkness he carried, not the destructive kind that turns inward or outward against the people nearest to you, but the ordinary darkness of a man who had seen things and done things, and was honest with himself about what they had cost. He told her, one night in January when the wind was loud against the walls and they were sitting very close to the stove, about his time serving as a lawman in a small Kansas town before he came to Texas, about a situation that had gone badly and left a man dead, who perhaps could have been left alive if Clarence had made a different choice in a fast and terrible moment. He had made the choice he made, and it had been defensible, and it had troubled him ever since. He told her this without making a performance of it, without asking for absolution, just telling her because they were married, and she deserved to know the things that lived in him. She listened, and she did not offer him comfort he had not asked for, which was the right response, and when he was done she said, "You carry it, but you haven't let it turn you mean. That matters." "It matters to me that you think so," he said. "Good," she said. She told him that same winter about Robert Alderman. All of it, the full truth, including the things she had been ashamed of afterward, the degree to which she had believed things she had known on some level were not reliable, the way hope could override judgment in ways you only fully understood after the hope had been proven false. She told him because he had told her his difficult thing, and because he had married her without knowing the whole of her history and she thought he should know. He listened the same way she had listened to him. When she was done, he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you, not because it made you cautious. The caution makes sense, and I think it protected you from things that would have been worse. I'm sorry because you deserved better and you were young and you got something that wasn't worthy of you." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the right thing to say," she told him. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it's right." Spring came the way spring came on the Llano Estacado, not gently but like a decision, the cold breaking and the ground softening and the grass beginning its determined, green advance across the brown of the winter plain. Celia planted her garden again with the knowledge of the previous season to guide her, and this time it flourished in a way that was deeply satisfying, the rows of vegetables coming up with a regularity that felt like a reward for the work of the year before. Clarence continued his work as deputy, and they had settled into a life that had its daily rhythms and its occasional disruptions, the ordinary fabric of a working household on the frontier. He rode out sometimes for 2 or 3 days when Sheriff Holt needed him further afield, and she managed the property in those absences without difficulty, because she had always been able to manage on her own. But she found that she missed him in a specific way, a quiet awareness of absence in the space where his presence had become ordinary. And when he came home, she did not make a great demonstration of the relief she felt, but she let him see it in her face, because she had decided that she was allowed to let him see things like that. In the spring, she realized she was going to have a child. She sat with the knowledge for a few days before she told him, turning it over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to any new information that required her to revise her understanding of her situation. She felt things about it that she had not expected, a complicated mixture of joy and terror, and a sudden and fierce protectiveness that arrived before she had even fully accepted the fact. She told him on a morning in April when the sun was well up, because that had become the way of them, the important things in full daylight. He was quiet for a moment that she spent watching his face for what she would find there. What she found was something she had not known she needed to see until she saw it. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then a recognition of what the surprise meant, and then something that was simple and clear and without reservation. He looked like a man who has been given something that he did not know how to deserve and was going to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. He reached across the table and took her hands. "Are you all right?" He said first, because he was always practical, always concerned with the actual and present welfare of the person in front of him. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm very much all right, in fact." He held her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm going to be very serious about this, you understand, about making sure you have what you need and that we're prepared." "I know," she said, and she did know because she had come to know him, to know that his seriousness was not heaviness but commitment, the specific commitment of a man who did not take the things that mattered lightly. "I'm also very happy," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, made her eyes prick in a way she managed to contain barely. "Good," she said. "So am I." She went to see the doctor in Dustfall, a man named Dr. August Pfeiffer, who had been practicing on the frontier for 20 years and had a calm and steady manner that she found reassuring. He confirmed what she already knew and gave her his assessment of her health, which was good, and told her what to expect in the months ahead. And she listened and asked specific questions and took careful notes, because that was how she approached every important project. Clarence told Sheriff Holt, because they were close enough that it would have been an omission not to, and Holt clapped him on the shoulder and said, "About time this county had more of the right kind of people in it," which was a typically indirect compliment from a man who was not given to direct ones, and Clarence understood it perfectly. Agnes Whitmore brought her a gift, a small quilt made from fabric scraps that was beautifully done, geometric and precise the way Agnes was, and Celia held it and thought that she had accumulated, without particularly intending to, the right kind of people around her, and that this was its own kind of wealth. The summer of 1879 was hot, and the garden was productive, and Celia worked through the heat with some modifications to her usual pace, because Dr. Pfeiffer had told her to be sensible, and she was a sensible woman. Clarence took over more of the heavier work without making a pointed drama of it, just quietly redistributing the labor in a way that left her dignity intact while managing the actual concern. She noticed and did not comment, which was the clearest way she knew to tell him that she appreciated it. They talked about names on evenings on the porch, the air cooling as the sky darkened, the first stars coming out over the plain. He had an idea. She had a different idea. They negotiated with the same seriousness they brought to property decisions and fence contracts, and arrived eventually at a name they both liked, which was William for a boy and Clara for a girl. In September of 1879, their son was born. The labor was hard and long, as first labors often were, and Mrs. Greeley served as midwife, being experienced and competent, and the kind of woman who said what needed to be said without drama, and Agnes Whitmore was there because she had offered, and because Celia had discovered she wanted her there. Clarence was in the house, within call, in a state of barely contained anxiety that he was managing with characteristic quiet, and that Celia was aware of in the same peripheral way. She was aware of the lamp, and the smell of cedar, and the specific density of the September night. All of it registered and held while she dealt with what needed dealing with. When the baby arrived, Mrs. Greeley put him in her arms, and he was small and red and loud, and he had a remarkable amount of dark hair in Clarence's jaw already, which seemed remarkable and also entirely right. She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. This particular person who had not existed this morning and now existed, completely and with full authority, in the world. Clarence came and sat beside the bed, and she turned so he could see the baby, and she watched her husband's face and thought she had never seen that exact expression on any face before, the complete and transparent wonder of a man who was holding the reality of something he had loved in theory, and now loved in specific, particular breathing fact. "William," Clarence said, very quietly to the baby, as though introducing himself. William, who was 1 hour old and had opinions, replied in the way of all newborns, forcefully and without precision. Celia laughed, which was not what she had expected to be doing at that moment, and Clarence looked at her with that expression that was his particular version of great happiness, and she thought that this room, this lamp, this cedar-smelling dark with the baby in her arms and her husband beside her and the prairie night outside, was something she wanted to remember exactly as it was. William James Walker, which was what they put on the record at the county, was a child of considerable personality from the very beginning. He was strong and curious and loud when he had opinions, which he had frequently, and he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a particular expression of focused intensity when he was interested in something that she recognized as coming from both of them. Clarence was a good father. She had suspected he would be, based on observable evidence, the way he listened to Tomas, the way he had looked at the Greeley grandchildren, the patience he brought to the things that required patience. But she had not fully imagined the specific way he would be. The quiet hours spent with William, explaining things to the baby, with the same earnest directness, he explained things to adults, not talking down but talking straight, as though William would eventually understand, and the practice in the meantime was reasonable. She caught him one morning sitting on the porch with William propped against his chest, the baby about 3 months old and therefore very interested in the world, telling William about the history of the cattle trade in some detail, and showing him the direction west with a sweep of his arm. And she stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of how much she loved him, without qualification and without the old cautiousness. Because she had arrived at a point where the cautiousness was simply no longer proportionate to the evidence. The years built themselves the way years do, one season into the next, each one leaving its mark on the land and on the people working it. Dustfall grew some, the way frontier towns either grew or shrank depending on the luck of the land and the stubbornness of the people in it, and Dustfall had the right kind of stubbornness. A second general store opened. The school got a second teacher when Agnes's classroom became too full for one person. The church got a proper bell to replace the piece of iron pipe it had been using. The Prescott property, which everyone in town still called the Prescott property even after it was fully the Walker property, became a real working enterprise. They added cattle, not many enough to be manageable, buying wisely from ranchers who were selling down and building slowly. Tomas, who had grown into a serious and capable young man, worked for them on a regular basis and eventually became essential, the kind of help that made the difference between scraping along and genuinely doing well. She and Clarence talked about the land and the future the way they talked about everything, directly and with all the available information on the table. She had ideas about what the property could become, and he had ideas, and not all the ideas were the same, and they worked through the differences with the same arguing toward truth method they had applied to George Eliot on the porch steps in that first summer. She won some of those arguments and he won some, and a few were resolved by trying both things and seeing which one worked, which was the most honest method. There was a day in the late fall of 1881. Celia was pregnant with their second child by then, when a stranger came through Dustfall who stopped at the general store, and then at the sheriff's office, and then, for reasons that took a moment to become clear, at her property. He was a man in his 40s, well-dressed for a traveling man, with the particular look of someone who had practiced looking like nothing in particular. He gave his name as Harlan Birch and said he was a property agent from Abilene, acting on behalf of clients he declined to name, and that he was authorized to make an offer for the Prescott Walker property, which his clients understood had been recently improved and was producing. He named a price that was fair, and then he named a better price when she did not respond to the first one, and she looked at him through the entirety of this with the flat, measuring regard she had developed for situations that required it. "The property is not for sale," she said. "My clients would be willing to negotiate," he said. "The property is not for sale at any price," she said, with a precision that left very little room for the word negotiation. "I built this. My husband and I built this. This is where we live and where our son was born and where our children will grow up. You may tell your clients that when something is not for sale, no amount of money changes what it is." Birch was professionally unfazed, which she had expected. He left a card and said his client's interest would remain open if she changed her mind, and he left with the same smoothness with which he had arrived, and she watched him go from the porch and then went back inside to her work. She told Clarence that evening, and he listened and then said, "The Caldwell outfit. My thought too," she said. "Different approach. They gave up on the fin scudding, so now they're trying to buy. We should let Amos know," he said. "Already sent a note," she said. He looked at her with that expression. "Of course you did," he said, and it was entirely a compliment. The inquiry from the property agent did not repeat, and nothing came of it, and she filed it away as information and went on with the work of the season. Their second child arrived in February of 1882, a daughter they named Ruth Eleanor Walker, and she arrived fast and without the long difficulty of her brother, as though she had assessed the situation and determined that speed was the efficient approach. She had Celia's dark hair and an expression of immediate alertness that made Dr. Pfeiffer remark that she seemed to have arrived with opinions already formed. William, who was 2.5 and had developed considerable confidence in his position in the household over the preceding months, was introduced to his sister with the same earnestness with which he approached all new information. He studied her for several minutes from a careful distance, and then approached and touched her hand with one finger, very gently, and then looked at his father with an expression that said he had made his assessment. "She is very small," William told Clarence. "She'll get bigger," Clarence said. "Will she be able to help with the chickens?" William asked, because the chickens were currently William's domain and he had been thinking carefully about delegation. "In a few years," Clarence said. William nodded, apparently satisfied with the timeline, and went back to studying his sister. Celia watched this from the bed and felt the specific and particular love that belonged to these moments, when the people she loved were in the same room together, and she could see the entirety of what she had built, not just the property, not just the land and the livestock and the well and the garden, but this family with its specific personalities and its ways of being together that were entirely its own. She had come to Dustfall with $17 and a horse and the intention of making something work, and she had done it. She had done it in ways she had not anticipated, and with a person she had not known would find her, and she had done it in the plain light of ordinary days, through work and honesty and the slow accumulation of trust. Clarence came and sat beside her on the bed, Ruth in her arms, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the easiness of a man in the place he belonged. And he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and she leaned into him with the same ease, the leaning she had once thought she would never allow herself. The prairie winter lay quiet and white outside the window, and the lamp was warm on the table. And from the other room came the sound of William talking to himself in the particular way of small children who were narrating their interior world. And she thought she had never been so precisely at the center of a life that was her own. The spring of 1882 was gentle, which was not always the case but was welcome, a slow and generous unfolding of warmth that brought the garden on beautifully and filled the water in the creek to the south, and made the cattle fat and contented on the new grass. Tomas brought his younger brother, now 16 and interested in learning ranch work, out to the property, and Celia agreed to take the boy on for the season, which made Tomas so pleased that he worked with double his usual efficiency for a week. Agnes Whitmore married a recently arrived doctor, a younger man named Foster who had set up a practice in Dustfall partly because he saw the need and partly because he had met Agnes at a community supper and found that he could not think about much else afterward. It was a quiet wedding which suited Agnes, and Celia and Clarence attended, and afterward Celia told Clarence that she had been rooting for Agnes and the doctor since October, which surprised him, as he had not been aware there was a situation to root for. "You missed all of it," she said. "I was aware there was interest," he said, somewhat defensively. "When did you notice?" she said. He considered. "When they danced at the church social in March." "I noticed in October," she said. He acknowledged this with a good-humored look. "You notice things I don't," he said. "And you notice things I don't," she said, which was true and which they had both become grateful for. Sheriff Amos Holt retired in the summer of 1882, citing his age and his preference for sitting on his porch over sitting in his office, both of which were reasonable preferences. The county held an election for sheriff, and there was some discussion about who should run, and the discussion in the Dustfall community produced, as discussions in small communities often do, a consensus before the official process had fully gotten underway. The consensus pointed clearly at Clarence Walker, and when it was pointed at him, he was reluctant in the specific way of a person who does not want the responsibility, but knows they are suited to it, and that their reluctance is therefore a self-indulgence. He talked to Celia about it on the porch, the way they talked about everything important, and she listened to the reluctance and the reasoning, and then she said, "Amos trusted you because you're the right kind of person for this work. The county needs that to continue. It would mean more time away from the property," he said. "We'll manage," she said. "We've always managed." "The pay is better," he said. "That helps," she said. He ran and he won, which was not quite the foregone conclusion that some people assumed, because there was a man named Garfield who wanted the position and had some support from the larger landholders, including what remained of the Caldwell influence. But the election went to Clarence by a comfortable margin, which said something about the character of the community that she found, in her heart, deeply satisfying. He put on Amos's office with the same straightforward seriousness he brought to every other responsibility, and he was a good sheriff, which was to say he was fair, and he was not afraid, and he understood that the law was a tool that needed to be used with judgment rather than simply with authority. She heard things about how he handled situations from various people in town, Agnes and Mrs. Greeley and the general storekeeper, things that confirmed what she already knew about him from direct observation. She was proud of him, though she was also the person who told him without sentiment when she thought he had made a mistake in something, because that was what partnership meant, and he received it the way he received everything from her, without resentment and with genuine attention. They argued occasionally. All people who live together and care about things argue, and they were both people who had clear opinions and the willingness to express them. Their arguments had the texture of people who respected each other, the kind of arguments where the point was not to win but to arrive at truth, and they were almost never about the things that mattered most, because on the things that mattered most they were so fully agreed that the agreement did not require discussion. He loved her. That was a fact in the way that the land and the sky and the seasons were facts, present and consistent, and not subject to revision. He demonstrated it in the ordinary daily ways of a man whose love was woven into the regular fabric of a life rather than held apart as a separate and special thing, in the cup of coffee placed at her elbow before she asked for it, and in the way he stood beside her when they were dealing with something difficult, and in the way he noticed when she was tired and adjusted things accordingly. She noticed all of it, and she received it, and she gave back what she had, which was considerable. William grew tall and curious and opinionated, which surprised no one who knew either of his parents. By the time he was 5, he was following Tomas around the property, with a level of focused interest that Tomas bore with great patience and occasional visible amusement, and he could name every animal on the property, and had begun to develop the proprietary concern for the cattle that characterized a person who genuinely understood what a herd meant. Ruth was a different kind of person entirely, quieter and more watchful, with an interior life that expressed itself in occasional startling observations, and a talent for mimicry that she deployed with great accuracy and very little mercy. She was 4 years old when she informed her father during his morning preparations that he made the same face when he was thinking that he made when he was worried, which was a distinction he had not known she had noted and which caused him to look at Celia with an expression of slight alarm. "She notices things," Celia told him. "She notices too many things," he said. "You say that like it's a concern," Celia said. "It is a concern," he said, "specifically regarding me." Celia laughed, and he looked at her in the way he had that was full of the particular helpless affection of a man who was very much in love with the person he was looking at. And she thought that this ordinary morning in their kitchen with the coffee and the children and the sound of the ranch beginning its daily work outside, was something she would never take for granted, because she knew what it had cost to arrive here, and she knew what she had once thought she would not have. The fall of 1883 was the 5th anniversary of her arrival in Dustfall, though she counted the years privately rather than publicly, it being the kind of thing she kept for herself. She stood on the porch one evening in October with the same golden light that had been falling on the same plain for 5 years, and she thought about the woman who had ridden in on a sorrel mare with $17 and a pistol, and the particular hard-edged determination of someone who had run out of other options. She had not known what she was building. She had thought she was simply surviving, and then she had thought she was simply working, and then she had thought she was simply making a life, and somewhere in all of that the building had happened, quietly and without announcement, the way the best things were built. Clarence came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the plain together in the fading light, and after a moment she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I want to tell you that I am glad you came back in the morning," she said. "When I told you I had no patience for promises made in the dark, I'm glad you understood what I meant, and I'm glad you waited." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass below the porch, and the light continued its slow descent. "I understood what you were protecting," he said. "I thought it was worth waiting for." She looked at him, this man who had waited for daylight to say the things worth saying, who had showed her by his actions before he asked her to take him at his word, who had made her laugh and argued with her honestly, and held her hands when she needed them held and stood beside her when things were hard, who had fathered her children and respected her judgment, and loved her in the full and specific way that she had once given up on being loved. She reached over and took his hand. "I'm glad, too," she said, "that you stayed, that you built this with me." "I wouldn't have it different," he said. "Neither would I," she said. They stood on the porch of the house they had made into a home, the house that had been her uncle's and before that nothing, on the land that was hers and his and their children's. And the last of the October light lay golden and clean across the Llano Estacado, and somewhere in the barn William was having an earnest conversation with one of the horses, and Ruth was sitting on the porch steps below them drawing something in the dust with a stick. And the mockingbird that nested in the cedar at the corner of the house was running through its repertoire with great confidence, and everything was exactly as it was, and everything was, by any honest measure, exactly right. Later that winter, When the norther came and the nights were long and cold and close, they would talk about the future of the property, the direction they wanted to take it in the next several years, the cattle operation and the garden, and the possibility of adding more land to the east if the right parcel came available. They would have those conversations with the same directness and seriousness they had always had, two people who respected each other's minds and were not afraid to say what they thought. And Ruth, who was growing into a person of remarkable precision, would sit quietly in the corner with the doll that Agnes Whitmore had made for her, apparently absorbed in her own world, while actually cataloging everything her parents said with the thoroughness of a very small archivist who understood that everything being said was important and might be needed later. And William, who was already measuring himself against the door frame every few weeks to track his growth with the statistical seriousness of a natural scientist, would come in from the cold with the smell of the barn on his coat and the look of someone who had been thinking hard about something. And he would sit down at the table and announce, in the way of a child who has no concept of an incomplete thought, that he had decided something, and his parents would listen with the same attention they gave each other. Because they had both been raised to understand that people deserve to be listened to regardless of their age. By Christmas of 1883, the house was warm and full of the smell of cedar and coffee, and the particular domestic richness of a home that was genuinely lived in. And when Clarence Walker looked at Celia Prescott Walker across the supper table on the evening of Christmas Day, with Ruth asleep on the settle and William barely awake beside her, he had the same expression she had seen on his face the morning he had come back at sunrise to say what he had meant in full daylight. She had warned him once that she had no patience for men who made promises in the dark. He had waited until morning and made every one of them. And on that December evening, in the lamplight of the home they had built on the edge of the Llano Estacado in the last great decade of the American frontier, she was glad of it down to her bones. Glad of the morning he had come back. Glad of the plain and honest daylight in which everything between them had been said and seen and measured and found true. Glad of every fence they had mended together, every argument they had argued toward truth, every morning coffee on the porch, and every evening conversation in the lamplight. Glad of the children who carried both of them in their faces and their ways of being in the world. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way she had that evening on the porch, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he always had. Outside, the Texas winter lay vast and cold and star-scattered across the plain, and Dustfall settled into its nighttime quiet, and the wind came in from the west the way it always did, carrying the smell of things far away. Inside, the stove burned warm and the lamp burned bright, and the Walker family was home.